You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the Teach Thought Podcast. Terry, introduce yourself.
My name is Terry Ike. I'm a former classroom teacher and now director at Teach Thought, which means I do a lot of different things very badly.
And I'm Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at Teach Thought, and hopefully that means I do a lot of different things really well.
And together we're hosting a podcast, which hopefully makes Teach Thought more accessible to you in more places, right, Drew?
Well, hopefully, yeah, but mostly it's just me hosting it because you just add episodes every so often, right?
Well, I've got things to do. Remember, I'm director.
That's true. Thanks for tuning into the Teach Thought Podcast once again. My name is Drew Perkins, Director of Professional Development here at Teach Thought. And I am once again excited to announce, I think I've mentioned it in our last podcast, or at least my last episode, that we have opened up pre-registration for next summer's PBL Grow 18 event, which is going to be held once again in Louisville, Kentucky, back at the Fraser History Museum. If you would like more information on that, you can go to wegrowteachers.com and you'll see a banner along the top that you can click on and see some information. We're still yet to release the full details, but you can pre-register, which will put your name on a list that you'll get an email from us that will let you know when official registration is open. But that is July 9th through 11th in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. We hope you can make it. In today's podcast, I spoke with Jesse Stommel, who is the Executive Director of the Division of Teaching and Learning at the University of Mary Washington. He's also the co-founder of the Digital Pedagogy Lab, and a journal called Hybrid Pedagogy is something that he's highly responsible for. I really enjoyed this podcast. It was something that I came across my radar as he wrote a blog piece about grading and not using grades, and we had, I think, a really interesting, at least interesting to me, discussion around grading and assessment and rubrics and the ecosystem of learning and all of those things. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation, maybe one of my most favorite podcast recordings. And hopefully, I look forward to future conversations with Jesse. So without further ado, I bring you Jesse Stommel. Welcome to the podcast. Today I have with me, calling in via Skype from Fredericksburg, Virginia, via England, right? Last night, both of us were doing the Road Warrior thing last night, so apologies to the listeners if there's any sleepiness in our voices, but Jesse Stommel, several roles that he has, but I'm going to let him talk about himself a little bit and introduce himself and talk about those different roles before we start talking about some of the work that he has published around grading, or actually not grading. So Jesse, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Great, thanks. I'm Jesse Stommel, and I've been teaching for about 17 years now. And in my current role, I am the Executive Director of the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies at University of Mary Washington. I've been here at UMW in Fredericksburg, Virginia for just over 2 years. And then I am the co-founder of Hybrid Pedagogy, which is a journal of learning, teaching, and technology. And I am the co-founder of Digital Pedagogy Lab, which is a institute. It is a 5-day institute currently held in Fredericksburg, Virginia, every year, usually first week of August, end of July. And we also do a series of international events around the world.
Great. Well, Jesse, you have sort of popped in and out of my sort of social media, Twitter feed, and have been vaguely aware of your work, but one of your more recent blog pieces that folks can find on jessestommel.com, and we'll link to that, but it is dated October 26th that it really caught my attention. I thought was really thoughtful and very much in line with the Teach Thought philosophy, but I thought worth a conversation for our listeners. But it's entitled "Why I Don't Grade," and really thought it was sort of funny and interesting that you start the blog piece around the basically saying that this really isn't radical, that you've been doing this for years. And what I thought would be an interesting starting point is to think about, because there's lots of teachers, I think, that would like that share that sentiment, that think, yeah, that sounds great, but they are working in institutions and in systems, and you talk about that a little bit in the blog piece, but they're working in systems in which grading is basically expected, even if it's not explicitly said that that's what has to happen. So how does that pragmatically work for you as a teacher, and what does that look like for reporting at the end, transcripts and those kinds of things? Let's just kind of start with the basic pragmatic practical applications of this.
Yeah, one of the things that I wrote in the piece is the notion that we often internalize certain expectations or requirements that haven't been told to us explicitly. So one of the things when I do workshops on grading, or when I give talks on grading or assessment, I often get a question exactly like the one that you're asking now. And one of the things I often ask back when people say, well, we're required to do it, is I ask them pretty bluntly, pretty cheekily. I'm not trying to put people on the spot, but I ask them, well, who requires you? Who has told you that you have to? Where do they tell you that you have to? What are the specific requirements? Because I think in many cases we internalize a lot more requirements or norms or expectations that our institutions actually enforce. However, I also want to add that this is not to undermine the fact that people who are teaching in institutions have real pressures that they face.
Sure.
And so in some ways, when I talk about my own approach, I have to acknowledge that every teacher works in a very different context. And part of the reason that at the beginning of the post, I talk about all of the various different contexts that I've worked in as a teacher is not necessarily to say, hey, look, you certainly can do this too, because look at all the different contexts I've taken this approach. It's essentially to say that all of those contexts are valid. And each one of the contexts that I talk about in the piece, I've taught for credit, non-credit, online, non-traditional students, traditional students, as a tenure track professor, as an adjunct, at a small liberal arts college, at a community college, at a Research One institution. Each of those contexts required something very different of me, and required that I think about and negotiate assessment and my grading practices differently. So it's not to necessarily flatten my experience and say, no matter where I was, I could do exactly the same thing. It's instead to say that all of those contexts require that we engage differently. And really, for me, the first step is just to say, what do grades do? Why do I do them? And to sort of ask yourself, how could I approach this differently in my context, or at least consciously? Because I think often we just unconsciously do what was done to us, or teach the way that we experienced, or use letter grades just because letter grades are a thing. So that sort of answers your question, although I also recognize that I'm kind of delaying the how a bit.
Right. And I'd like to get into that, at least in your classes, because I do think it's important to recognize that just saying this is how I do it and I think this is a better way doesn't mean that everybody can do that. It takes there's a big ecosystem, lots of pressures, and I think you're right in that many teachers, sort of the idea of non-negotiables, like this is what is expected of you. Well, what would happen if you didn't do that? And how might you do it differently? And I do think that, from what I can gather, you really approach this from an inquiry perspective of what are the questions that we're trying to answer with our assessments, and in what way do grades help us do that? And there's some really strong language here that I guess I'd like to get you to sort of unpack, if you will, in the opening sort of salvo and I'll just read it for our listeners. Grades and institutional rankings are currency for a capitalist system that reduces teaching and learning to a mere transaction. Grading is a massive coordinated effort to take humans out of the educational process. So talk a little bit more, or unpack that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, well, in some ways, when I started writing this particular piece, I've written on grading before, and when I started writing this particular piece, my idea was that it would be the first in a series, and I do intend to write more pieces. And even at the end of the piece, I hint towards the next piece being about the kind of how, the actual mechanics of what this looks like.
Right.
In some ways, that sentence there that you read is kind of manifesto-like. I almost feel like the Darth Vader intro march should be playing it as you read it. But in some ways, it's like a call to myself. It's sort of a push to kind of think about this and realize how powerful and important and how influential grades are in a learning environment. And in some ways, I think that that sentence is there. It's there to raise eyebrows so that people pay attention to the rest that follows. On the other hand, I don't think that that sentence is designed to make people feel bad for being a part of the system that's being described there. Because many of us, I talk about it's a coordinated effort. Well, coordinated by who? In some ways, I think at this point, it's a coordinated effort by a mixture of institutions and political forces and also commerce. I think there's a lot of educational tools, educational technologies that are built around reinforcing the system that we're currently working in. For example, learning management systems. Learning management systems, both in K-12 and in higher ed, are structured around the grade book. And so they're structured around a way of thinking about how teaching and learning happens, that essentially teaching and learning is transactional. A teacher gives an assignment, teacher does some work, student does some work, the teacher reflects on that work, gives the student back a grade. It's a sort of exchange. It's a transactional system, sort of what Paulo Freire describes as the banking model of education. Mm-hmm. And I think that our educational technologies, for example, which are driven by corporate interest in many cases, more than pedagogical interest, are structured around these kinds of neat and tidy transactions. Because if you make a student really distinct from a teacher, if you make the thing that's happening, the stuff of learning, into a mere transaction that results in a neat and tidy spreadsheet, where students are rows and the work they do is columns. If you reduce learning to that, it's much easier to sell and package learning. So that's essentially what I'm getting at when I say there's a lot of stuff collapsed in grades are currency for a capitalist system that reduces teaching and learning to a mere transaction. But that's sort of what some of that stuff is that's packed into that sentence.
So how do you see the relationship between what a teacher's doing as teaching and what a student's doing as sort of a formative assessment? How does that play out in your mind in light of the context of what we're talking about here, not having grades?
I think that the goal in my classroom is and this is in some ways I say my classroom because I don't necessarily think every teacher should teach the same. Really, the piece is not arguing for people to grade the way that I do or to not grade the way that I do. Instead, it's, as you said, to get people to think about their pedagogy and be thoughtful in how they engage with the decisions they make around their pedagogy. And ultimately, I think ideally those would proliferate. Students would experience lots of different kinds of learning environments. But one thing that's important for me in my classroom is to disrupt or deconstruct that distinction between student and teacher, the distinction between the work of teaching and the work of learning, to give students a space where they can really take ownership of their own learning. And in some ways, as long as the teacher is structuring the environment, as long as the teacher is giving the assignments, as long as the teacher is doing all of the evaluating and assessing at the end, and then the whole thing is tied up with a neat and tidy bow of you get an A- or you get a B+ for the course. I don't think I think that reinforces the hierarchy between students and teachers and doesn't create a space where students can take ownership of their learning.
Well, so then as we sort of play this out, and think about, and I am very much a proponent of sort of flattening that and thinking about how, because you really lean heavily on student self-assessment. I'm guessing a fair amount of peer critique perhaps in this process as well, that it's not always the teacher that is the one that is saying that you're either right or wrong. I do wonder, I guess my question is, as you're thinking about sort of content and pieces and things that are for especially I'm thinking of lots of K-12 teachers that are responsible for delivering, teaching, and then of course being held accountable for some content, whether those tests that are accountability tests are valid and reliable philosophically. We can set that aside for the moment, but there's certainly some things that teachers want students to learn, to think about, to consider. And how do you see that playing out in this landscape, this perhaps radically different landscape of a teacher? How do I know that they got it and they understand and have really thought about this deeply?
Yeah, one of the quotes from my blog post, I quote Amy Fast, and she writes, "The saddest and most ironic practice in schools is how hard we try to measure how students are doing and how rarely we ever ask them." And I think that the reason that is in there is because so often we imagine that we can create an objective structure that's somehow distinct from the student. So we can kind of create a layer, an observational layer over top of the student and their learning that can give us some kind of objective bird's eye view of the student learning process. And that's a lot of our assessment is about that. It's about watching and observing, collecting papers, and then trying to imagine some kind of objective standard that we can put the work to. Rubrics are like this, rubrics that are designed well in advance of students coming to a course, as though you can just kind of run students' work through a rubric mill and it'll spit out an objective answer at the other end of whether they got the learning or got the content. And I think Amy Fast in this quote, what she does for me is she kind of nails in a single tweet, this quote was tweeted, she nails in a single tweet the piece that's really missing when we do that, when we run student work through rubrics, when we try and take this bird's eye view. And that is that there's a much simpler way to know whether or not students are learning in a lot of cases, and that's to ask the students, how much did you learn? What did you get out of this? What things do you feel like you still need to work harder on? And those are, I mean, I'm not going to say that necessarily students will always have good answers to those questions, because that kind of metacognitive work is some of the hardest work that we can do. Mm-hmm. But I think that the conversation should start there, not with the teacher somehow extracting themselves from the learning situation and objectively, even objectifying the students in some way.
Does that conversation, that metacognitive piece in your brain change, and student reflection on their learning, does that change as you drop down? Because lots of your work, it sounds like, is at the higher ed, and I'm imagining an elementary teacher saying, yeah, but my kids don't have that sophistication of thinking and communication quite yet. So does that change for you as you get down into a lower level, younger kids?
So I definitely don't want to speak for K through 12 teachers, because I have no experience teaching in K through 12. I have taught my entire career in higher education, as well as non-traditional learners, which in some cases the non-traditional environments have included some high school students and even some younger than high school students. However, I am a dad. I have a 10-month-old, and my 10-month-old is brilliant. And I expect that when she's 6, when she's 8, she's going to be like most of the other kids I've known in my life. And when she's 10, and the kids that I've known who are 6, 8, 10, 14 are incredibly good at thinking about who they are in the world and reflecting on their environment. In some ways, they are doing that all the time because they're trying to figure out who they are in the world. If you think about a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old, thinking about who am I and how much do I know And how quickly am I growing? Like, these are the questions that their brain is tossing and turning about. And, sometimes it's a little in bit of an agitated way. I remember when I was 13 or 14, there was a lot of emotional stuff going on in addition to that kind of soul searching and finding yourself. So to imagine somehow that kids, whatever age they are less sophisticated than adults at doing that kind of work. I mean, I think that then we get into a nitpicking of what do we mean by sophistication? Because I think kids are incredibly good at doing that, sometimes better than adults. I think adults have been, for the most part, we're talking about adults who have been run through a school system that has, in a lot of ways, taught that kind of behavior out of them. We are very, very primed for being assessed by grades, by rubrics, by 5-point scales. Even when I get an evaluation at work, I'm graded in a sense on a 1 to a 5.
Right.
And we're very good at thinking in that way. We're very good at thinking about sort of pulling ourselves out of ourselves and imagining that we can objectify our own behavior and objectify our own learning processes.
Well, I think you're hitting on some things, certainly some things that resonate with me, and I try to talk about when I work with schools and leaders and leadership, and certainly it's a difficult thing to think about and to actually do in light of lots of, again, the ecosystem and pieces, but there are ways to get into the qualitative versus the quantitative, and I'll refer back to your blog piece. You're talking about your syllabus, saying, all right, so this course will focus on qualitative, not quantitative assessment, and lots of the work that we do with teachers in assessment is around qualitative, and in our project-based learning model, it's about qualitative leverage. So what are the words and the questions and the language that we can use to get kids to think differently and to engage them in deeper thinking, and what is the evidence that we can collect and that they can collect and talk about as a narrative around the learning and the process and the journey. It drives me crazy to see was it Rubistar or whatever, and when we have teachers do some sort of assessment of students presenting, for example, and we give them a rubric that is a 1 through 5, kind of like what you're saying. I think it's from Rubistar or something like that. It's a generic, and they'll happily use it. They'll look at it and they'll say, oh, they sort of checked this box, but that was a 2, and then this is maybe a 3. So I'd give them a 2.77389, and it starts to become absurd, right? And so when we talk about, well, what did you see there? What they do is they give evidence. And so why don't we change that? And why don't our rubrics give us an opportunity to give that feedback and to tell that story and show evidence in a way that is meaningful without assigning a point, a score, a grade, or what have you? And I think the other aspect of that is how do we get students engaged in the process of sort of building the language around that rubrics, because again, that's an opportunity for critical thinking.
Yeah. I'm gonna kind of push back on some of what you're saying, but I also agree with everything that you're saying. Again, it's complex.
Right.
But the words that I want to push back on is I want to push a little bit on the word evidence. In part because I'm thinking about the long history of evidence-based practices, and what does that evidence look like, and the kind of assumptions of what that evidence looks like. And my pushback or my question for you is, the thing that I do when I enter a learning experience is I think, what is it? What's the peak learning experience I want students to have? And just some examples. And certainly there's all kinds of other learning experiences they have on their way to these peak learning experiences. But there are things like have an epiphany, things like have a thought I've never had before, things like struggle with not knowing, things like sit comfortably with my questioning. Things like that, things that I think of as the kind of learning moments that make you make your spine tingle.
Right.
And then I ask, what's the evidence for those? Like, have an epiphany. You had an epiphany. You tell me you had an epiphany. And then I say, well, give me evidence that you had an epiphany. It's like what I'm trying to ask is there some things that are these peak learning experience that actually evade evidence,
right?
That they actually evade our ability to neat and tidily describe them. I also think about rubrics, for example. Where do you put have an epiphany on a rubric? Like, what box does it fit in? Like, all the rubrics I've seen, I can't possibly fathom which box I would put have an epiphany in. And so it's not to say that all that other stuff that's in the rubric is useless, but if we imagine something like have an epiphany as the peak that we're trying to get to, I think to some extent we have to be willing to acknowledge that evidence is important and acknowledge that being able to describe learning is important, but also recognize that sometimes our ability to put language around learning is going to evade us.
Right. Yeah. And so a couple of things, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with single point rubrics, as I'm a big fan of single point rubrics because it gives you an opportunity. Essentially, it is one column of these are. Some people will use the term standards. I prefer in our project-based learning. Project design rubric doesn't use the word standards, it's ideals, because these are the things that we're constantly in pursuit of, things like rich inquiry, things like autonomy, meaningful assessment, those kinds of things. So within whatever course you're teaching, whatever the work the students are doing, so that middle column is for us ideals, or some folks might say standards, and on the right is just an empty box of here's the evidence, here's things that show that you kind of got that you did that or exceeded kind of that standard, if you will. And on the left is an opportunity to say, yeah, I'm wondering if this is evidence that maybe you didn't quite get there. And so I wonder then, is having had an epiphany language that would actually be evidence that that you had a peak learning experience. Well, I had an epiphany, and it is hard to quantify, which is one of the troublesome things of education, and it's not easy. It's very difficult, but it also gets to one of the other points I think that you raise, at least in my mind, it gets to the point of subjectivity rather than objectivity, and this sort of silly notion that somehow we have to be absolutely objective in every single way, when in reality we're teachers and it's our job, we're professionals, and not everything has to be objective. So to me, I wonder if that language around evidence, if something like having an epiphany isn't the language that shows evidence.
Yeah, and actually, single point rubrics remind me a little bit of something I'm going to talk about in a future blog post, where I do delve in more into the kind of hows or the mechanics of not grading. A piece that has long been influential by me is a piece by Peter Elbow, where he talks about minimal grading. And the notion of minimal grading, that they're essentially boiling a rubric down to much fewer columns, much more discrete and able to communicate. For example, a 5x5 rubric is just bewildering to me. I can't imagine anyone that looks at a 5x5 rubric and that actually helps them make sense of anything.
It's amazing.
I look at it and my brain just goes, what am I even looking at?
Right.
But a single point rubric, it does convey really clearly what it conveys a lot of information in a very simple and discrete way. And I imagine when students do the work of filling in the single point rubric, it helps them do that kind of metacognitive work.
Right.
What I would love is a student, their evidence being to describe what an epiphany feels like. I got the hair on my spine tingled.
Right.
I found myself getting restless. I actually stood up and I gesticulated, or whatever it is. But somehow that seems like really cool, good evidence.
Right.
The one thing that's hard with something like have an epiphany is you can't know what your epiphany is going to be about. And so oftentimes have an epiphany is the exact moment when you sort of veer away from the learning objective. Like you have a learning objective, you think that you're moving towards something, and then the epiphany is sort of the schism, the moment where you kind of fall down a rabbit hole. And I think we have to have a lot more space in our learning environments for students to be able to fall down rabbit holes, for them not to necessarily get to the objectives because they see something else shiny along the way.
So the idea for you as a sort of a structured curriculum, and these are things that students should come out of a course having knowledge and understanding of, is that a little messier then?
I think it's a little messier than that. I mean, I think I've written a bit about emergent outcomes. So outcomes, you can't actually know the outcomes fully until you're inside the learning environment. So the one thing, it's not necessarily that we don't end up with objectives or outcomes. It's that sometimes I find it a little strange that all of those outcomes and objectives are often written before the students arrive upon the scene. So we write our learning objectives before we've even met the students. And I find that a little odd. Why not write the objectives after we know who the students are? So we might end up with objectives, but we don't write them until after we've met the students, after we've seen who they are and where they're at in their learning. And ideally, we write them with the students. My colleague, Sean Michael Morris, he actually tweeted recently, and it just kind of blew my mind. He said, maybe learning objectives are something you're supposed to meet halfway through the course. And then the rest is just kind of what opens up for you from there. And you can't necessarily know until after you hit that objective where you're going to head next. And so I think that the distinction is, I often use the notion of a trajectory. You have a trajectory, you have a direction that you're pointing in, but you don't necessarily know when you're going to end up. It's like you set out on a walk and you know you're going to move west. You know you're going to move towards the trees, but you haven't decided yet where you're going to eat that day, or what stone you're going to sit on, or what moment you're going to choose to sit and spend an hour meditating, etc.
So the idea that all who wander are not lost is sort of applied to education, and I'm imagining as that unfolds, and as listeners might be processing this, especially those teachers who have been encultured to, one of the big pieces, and I've written about it, is a barrier, and it's a friction point that we talk about in lots of our project-based learning work or inquiry work or authentic learning work, is rigid curriculum and those sort of practices and systems that are in place. And I have been in an elementary school where I've worked with teachers. I went from kindergarten to first grade, and they're sitting at adjacent tables, and they were talking about project-based learning and ideating. And so one was talking about rock and soil, and the next table was talking about rock and soil. And I thought, oh, okay, so we should have a collaborative conversation here around what a project might look like. And they said, well, kindergarten says we can't talk about, we can only have students consider what rock and soil is. First grade, we have to stay in our lane. First grade's lane is what you might do with rock and soil. So they felt constricted by that, so much so that, you start to, it's laughable, right? Like, why would you not explore that? And as a first grade teacher, why would you not be happy that kindergarten teachers explore that? But that uneasiness of teachers that I'm imagining as you're talking about sort of revising learning outcomes on the fly, I'm wondering how that looks in your teacher preparation, because as I understand that you're executive director, Division of Teaching and Learning. So what does that look like from a teacher preparation perspective?
Yeah, one of the things that I wish, and I don't feel like we're there. I wish teaching was more thoroughly collaborative. And I know that it is in certain school districts. It is certainly at in certain departments in higher education. But I don't think that we have accepted across the board that teaching is a collaboration. And so teaching is a collaboration not only between the teacher and the students, but also a collaboration between teachers. And so the notion of staying in your lane is sort of directly at odds with teaching being a collaboration. So that there's this sense of kind of effortlessly passing students off from one to the next. And I don't mean from one year to the next, but that you're actually working together all the while to talk about what your teaching practices are, what's going on in the classroom. And I think about in some ways, I think why restrict students from falling down rabbit holes with this notion of, oh, they're going to learn that next year. Well, can't they learn it this year and then talk about it again next year?
Right.
I mean, it's not like learning doesn't happen in neat and tidy little chunks that you can just, process through a factory.
It does if you're a policymaker.
Yeah, it does. And it's too bad that it does if you're a policymaker, because then that kind of attitude ends up trickling down to teachers, and not necessarily because teachers believe it to be true, but because the system is structured so tightly. Yeah, and I'm not just talking about the policies. I'm talking about the way that the buildings are structured, the way that the classroom is arranged, the furniture that is there when you get there. All of those things are reinforcing the notion that learning is just a neat and tidy nugget that you get the first bit, and then you get the second bit, and then you put the second bit on top of the third bit. And I think anything that we can do as teachers to break that down, to just let students have learning experiences. On the other hand, now I want to push back on myself and say that there are also instances where there are a set of things that I am going to teach someone so that then in a future class, they have some of those building blocks.
Right.
So it's not like I would dismiss that as true. And same thing, we were talking about objectivity versus subjectivity earlier. It's not like I would say, let's ban objectivity from the classroom. All we need is subjectivity. The point is that we're already drowning in objectivity. We're already drowning in learning as a transaction, or learning as neat and tidy little learning objects. And so anything that we can do to push back against that stream, it's not like we're going to completely divert its course. We're still going to be drowning in objectivity. But if we can even find one moment with students where we can just kind of pull out of that, I mean, that's an epiphany. A moment where you don't see the structure of the room and how it's confining what you do in the room. A moment where all we see is each other, and we're having a conversation, and we get lost in that conversation, and then we don't know what room we're even in. Like, if we can have those moments here and there, that's the thing that I think allows us to continue working inside of these institutions that have all of these structures and restrictions.
So then again, sort of coming back to the sort of pre-service teachers, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the work that your department or what you do is pre-service. Would that be a fair assumption?
So actually, I work mostly with higher ed teachers.
Okay.
So I'm teaching higher ed teachers as opposed to teaching K through 12 teachers. And the interesting thing with higher ed teachers is that we are really, in many cases, not trained to be teachers. So you're getting people who've already been teaching in some cases for 2, 3, 5, 10 years without having even cracked a book about pedagogy or teaching and learning, and without having had a course in pedagogy or teaching and learning. And so getting higher education to shift to value the kinds of work that you do, that sort of is much more standard in K through 12. This just even notion that teachers should get training, teachers should have mentors, sort of wrapping people around that. So essentially, the institute that I run, the Digital Pedagogy Lab Institute, has, at this point, it's more higher ed. We also do get quite a few K through 12 teachers as well. But at this point, it's probably 75% higher education teachers.
Interesting. So the idea that because they're experts in their field means that they probably would make for a good teacher, but which is clearly not necessarily true. And there's a real balance between pedagogy and sort of content expertise. And that kind of gets to one of the last pieces here that I'd like to talk about, which is one of the last pieces in your blog piece, the idea of mastery. And one of the things that I'm curious to get your sort of reaction to this, but one of the pieces things that I often say and push back on is the idea that we want students to come out of a course as content area experts. It just seems absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I taught many different courses and for example, AP Psychology, starting that course by saying, look, I don't know everything about this course, or everything that's in this textbook that we will be using as a resource I haven't committed it to memory. That's not my job. And in some sense, in service of an AP test, it sort of is for them to sort of get all of that understanding. And that's a whole, again, another philosophical argument we can put to the side. But the idea of being a content area expert seems a bit ludicrous to me. But the idea that what we really want is, and a more reasonable and attainable goal, is that we get students to be able to think like content area experts. And so again, it's really about the thinking. It's not about the stuff. And how does that sort of fit with your philosophy, especially around this idea of mastery?
Yeah, I would wonder if oftentimes when we talk about experts, I think it's too big of a container. Like, can anyone be the kind of expert that we're describing? On the other hand, if we think about people who are experts at particular behaviors or experts at much smaller nuggets of thinking, maybe they can get there. On the other hand, I also think that students are experts in things. And, if I go back to my 10-month-old daughter, she's much more of an expert in play than I am. I've in many ways forgotten how to play. And I didn't necessarily, I'm a pretty playful guy, Mm-hmm. I didn't really even realize it until I just sit and I watch her and I watch what she does and how she engages in the world and how much curiosity she has. She's an expert in curiosity. And so for me to necessarily say that that kids don't have expertise in things, I think that they have expertise that far outweighs our own in some cases. And so I think they can be experts. What they can't be is some kind of predetermined notion of what an expert is. They can't be, essentially you add content area experts. They can't be content area experts, but that's probably because we should be questioning this notion of content. Mm-hmm. Is content the thing that we should be experts in? I don't think so. I don't necessarily think it is what has made me successful in my career. I don't think it's my content area expertise. And in fact, doesn't that kind of just sounds, my daughter, if she could speak, she probably would say, Dad, that sounds really boring. Who really wants to be a content area expert? I'm sorry to anyone listening who loves being a content area expert. Let's have a conversation so you can tell me what's so great about being a content area expert.
I think there are some out there who do. I'm a social studies teacher, or was by trade, if you will, and I agree with you. But there are lots of sort of history teachers that I think enjoy. Matter of fact, I was working with a teacher earlier this year around some of the ideas of flipped learning, and we were talking about how you might take some of those pieces that you might do in class, of course, and take them outside, and so that you would work differently and use that class period. And he said something to the effect of, I don't know that I could do flipped learning. I really enjoy talking about my content too much, which of course raised all kinds of red flags and bells, and I just wanted to scream and yell and go, holy cow, how in the world, what is happening here? But try to move along with the work and ask some poignant questions at that point.
Yeah, I guess there's this saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. And I sort of, in my brain, I can think, if you meet the content on the road, kill it. The second that you start to hold content up as this thing that you kind of enshrine, I think that that's not critical thinking. I mean, critical thinking never does that. It's about always having an eyebrow raised,
Right.
Always kind of cocking your head to the side and wondering at things. Like, wonder is super powerful. And I think, even in fields like history, even in certainly fields like science. So content, it's not to say that content doesn't exist or content isn't something important, but content is something that we marvel at, something that we cock our head at, something that we push on and prod on, something that we, pick up like a box full of Legos and dump out on the table and sift through it. It's not something that we enshrine, something that we imagine to be static and or something that we collect without playing with it and manipulating it.
Right. Grist for the mill, if you will. And I really appreciated the example that you used of being a doctor. And I don't think you necessarily said this explicitly, but it brought to my mind, like, I know, like, you're talking about being sort of a doctor and how would you want your doctor to have been assessed? And clearly all of us want to go to a doctor who knows their stuff, right? But what we don't want, and I think this happens with doctors, it happens with lawyers, it happens with teachers, it happens with basically every profession, that there are people who know their stuff but aren't able to do the critical thinking. And so I imagine, and I would imagine that lots of people have had similar experiences where you go to a doctor and they just sort of, they're essentially just doing a checklist of, well, here's your symptoms and here's what you have. And in most cases that works fine, but what happens when you have some sort of weird malady that doesn't quite fit, and they just there are times when doctors seem unable to be able to sort of understand and think through, well, so it's not one of these very common things, so maybe it's something different, and I might have to think a little bit here to be able to diagnose this differently and treat this differently. And that's what we really want from doctors or engineers or lawyers or teachers or whatever, right?
Yeah, well, I think an acceptable doctor, a mediocre doctor, can check all the boxes.
Right.
An expert doctor, a sort of profoundly good doctor, a wonderful doctor, a doctor that I keep for the rest of my life, that doctor thinks outside of the box. They look at my health with that kind of eyebrow raise.
Right.
And I think the same thing with teachers. Like, teachers can be good, checking boxes,
right,
meeting outcomes, having their students experience success, whatever that word success means.
Right.
I think an expert teacher, a profoundly good teacher, a great teacher, is someone who experiences new things along with their students and essentially has their students doing things in the classroom that it would be impossible to grade. So it isn't just that you don't grade, it's that you actually find ways in the classroom to do things that turn grading into a red herring.
Right. Well, I'm mindful of your time. That reminds me of a blog piece that I tried to articulate some of that around teaching. Good teachers sort of stick the lines, and great teachers and sort of profound ones, I like the word profound as well, are ones where that sort of spur students to create their own lines, and that I think is a good distinction. So before I let you go, any place that folks should, I will link to the website, but I know you're on Twitter, and where else should people get in touch with you, and what do you want them to see and know about you?
Cool. Yeah, I would say my favorite place to engage with other teachers is Twitter. So I'm at Jessifer on Twitter, and we do as I said earlier, we do a Summer Institute every year. It's coming up in last week of July, first week of August, and that's at digitalpedagogylab.com. And also the journal Hybrid Pedagogy is a really great place to find more of this kind of thinking. And the other thing I would say for K through 12 teachers especially is the real goal of Hybrid Pedagogy, the journal that I co-founded, was to put all of these conversations together in the same room. So there's so much expertise among the K through 12 community, and so much expertise among the non-traditional learning community and the higher ed community and the online learning community, et cetera, and just putting all those folks in the same room is the goal. And so if there are K through 12 folks who want to submit to hybrid pedagogy, I would absolutely encourage it.
Fantastic. Well, Jesse, I would thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the thinking, and have enjoyed our conversation, and look forward to potentially some more, and your blogs and that kind of work around grading, I think, is really, really thoughtful.
Great. Thank you so much.
That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and if you didn't hate it, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening, and share it on social media wherever you feel comfortable. Speaking of social media, you can find us in all the normal places like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and please share us on those places as well. And don't forget about TeachThought Professional Development. You can find us there at teachthought.com/PD.